G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.13 After the Apostles, Part 1, Out of the Mist. Some time ago I concluded my 4-part series on the earliest Christians. I move on. In the next few shows, I will throw around a lot of dates and names. Now, a podcast is the worst way to make sense of that. That's why my website, www.historyinthebible.com, has a free printable PDF timeline of early Christian works and notable figures. It will warm your heart for the rest of the season. Why not tack it on to your wine fridge? By the year 70, the end of the Great Revolt, all the disciples were dead, with the possible exception of John. The stories and legends that he died a full 30 years later in Asia Minor are persistent enough to let us entertain the possibility. We are now in the age of the Apostolic Fathers, the generation after the disciples. These are the people who flourished in the 60 years between the Great Revolt in 70 and the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132. Later tradition said these figures knew the disciples. Many modern scholars squirm at that appellation, Apostolic Fathers. They point out that it is built on the antiquated idea that earliest Christianity was from its very beginning a homogeneous monolith that could trace an unbroken line of sanctified orthodoxy from the disciples to the present day. These professors are quite right. Still, I remain fond of the term and will persist with it. 4 individuals emerge from the mist of this time: Clement, Bishop of Rome; Papias, or Papias, or Papias, or Porpius. I've got a whole bunch of different pronunciations. Bishop of Hierapolis; Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch; and Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna. These episcopal titles must be taken with a grain of salt the size of Belgium. The later church was keen to establish that it was a structured organisation from its very foundation. We know that was very much not the case. To these luminaries, we add some writers whom we cannot see at all: the anonymous authors of the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Didache. Let me make an important point. While the Apostolic Fathers were writing their works, the various authors who made it into the New Testament were also putting pen to papyrus. John, Matthew, and Luke were polishing their Gospels and the book of Acts. Admirers of the long-dead Paul were writing the fan-fiction letters of Timothy and Titus, and the devotees of the disciple John were forging letters in his name. If all these people were writing at the same time, why did none of the books of the Apostolic Fathers become part of our New Testament? And the answer is they very nearly did. We have many lists of books that early Christians thought should be part of the sacred canon. The books of the Apostolic Fathers are often cited. Through a centuries-long process, about which we have no insight, the Church eventually settled on the books that we know as the New Testament. Even so, Latin West and Greek East were in dispute for quite a while. The books of Revelation, the 3rd letter of John, the 2nd letter of Peter, and the letters to Timothy and Titus were in contention for generations. They competed with the Apostolic Fathers and with the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of the Hebrews. Who decided which books in the empire received God's imprimatur and which were tossed into the rubbish bin? We can make a guess. None of the books that were knocked out of contention from the canon showed any interest in the life or sayings of Jesus. Let's run through our first tranche of fathers. I introduced these ancients a few years ago in Season 2. It's time for a closer look. We start with Bishop Clement of Rome. Clement is regarded as the earliest of the Apostolic Fathers. In the West, they said he was consecrated by St. Peter himself to follow the disciples as second Bishop of Rome. The Greek Easterners held him to be the fourth after Peter. In early church tradition, Clement was the intermediary through which the apostles taught the church. We know nothing about Clement the man. Clement has a Roman name, just like Paul, and writes in Greek, just like Paul. Clement quotes from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Tanakh, just like Paul. Fanciful legends associated him with various Roman aristocrats. We only know Clement through letters attributed to him by later tradition. The letters circulated widely in the East. Variants were adopted by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as canon. No letter actually claims Clement as author. Of all his supposed letters, only 1st Clement is now considered authentic. It's quite a lengthy letter, twice as long as Paul's longest, the letter to the Romans. Some scholars claim that 1st Clement was written prior to the Great Revolt in 66. That would make 1st Clement the very earliest Christian document after Paul's authentic letters. But the letter calls the Corinthian church ancient. That seems inappropriate, as Paul had founded the club less than 15 years earlier. The epistle refers to a great persecution. Early Christians held that the Emperor Domitian launched the first systematic persecution of Christians in the 80s or 90s. Most modern historians now doubt that Domitian ever persecuted any religious community. So there goes that theory. Still, scholars think that the year 90 is about right for the letter. The epistle could not have been written much later. The letter implies that the deaths of Peter and Paul took place within our own generation. It states that there are still living leaders of the Jesus clubs who had been appointed by the disciples. If we have our dates right, Clement was a younger contemporary of the evangelists Matthew, Luke, and John. Clement could not have known the finished Gospels, since their authors were still composing them. Clement quotes from 4 letters of Paul, 2 of which were inauthentic. He also uses the massive oral tradition that Matthew and Luke relied on. Some scholars give themselves hernias by straining to argue that Clement knew a bunch of other books, but even they admit Clement could just be quoting the Old Testament. 1st Clement gives us our earliest glimpse into the social transformation of the Jesus clubs. 1st Clement shows us the first inkling that the autonomous clubs are networking into a franchise. 30 years earlier, preachers like Paul had founded little independent clubs. Clement writes from Rome to chastise the club in Corinth. The club has sacked some of their old leaders, presbyters, elders appointed by the disciples. Clement is outraged. Quote, 1st Clement 3. Every kind of honour and happiness was bestowed upon you, and then was fulfilled that which is written. My beloved ate and drank, and was enlarged, and became fat and kicked. Hence flowed emulation and envy, strife and sedition, persecution and disorder, war and captivity. So the worthless rose up against the honoured, the foolish against the wise, the young against those advanced in years. End quote. Clement asserts the authority of the presbyters as rulers of the church on the ground that the apostles had appointed them. The latter is the earliest argument for apostolic succession. Since the deposed leaders at Corinth stood in the lineage of those chosen by the apostles, to oppose them is to set oneself against the will of Jesus. Quote, 1 Clement 44. Our apostles also knew there would be strife on account of the office of the episcopate. For this reason, they appointed those ministers already mentioned, and afterwards gave instructions, that when these should fall asleep, other approved men should succeed them in their ministry. We are of the opinion, therefore, that those appointed by them, and who have blamelessly served the flock of Christ, cannot be justly dismissed from the ministry. But we see that you have removed some men of excellent behaviour from the ministry. End quote. Next up is the Didache. The little book The Didache is the only rival to the first letter of Clement for the most ancient Christian document outside the New Testament. Didache means teaching. Until the late 19th century, we had fragments preserved in early church fathers. An adventurous Greek bishop recovered a complete manuscript of the Didache from a monastery in Istanbul and published his discovery in the 1880s. Two ancient fragments of the work were later unearthed, a Greek papyrus in Oxyrhynchus and a Coptic papyrus lying unexamined in the British Museum. The publication was an overnight sensation. The unquestionably ancient manuscripts were a spotlight on the very earliest Christian practices undocumented in the New Testament. Scholars are confident of the antiquity of the Didache because it speaks of an age of itinerant preachers. In particular, it instructs its readers on dealing with freeloaders. Quote, Didache 4. Let every apostle who comes to you be received as the Lord, but let him not stay more than 1 day, or if need be a second as well. But if he stay 3 days, he is a false prophet. And when an apostle goes forth, let him accept nothing but bread till he reaches his night's lodging. But if he ask for money, he is a false prophet. Now, scholars are really unsure which is the earlier, the first letter of Clement, dated to the year 90 or so, or the Didache. We can make arguments for either case. The Didache's world is the world of the apostles, one of travelling preachers. The Didache is ignorant of the corporate hierarchies hinted at by Clement and discussed at length a few decades later by the apostolic father Ignatius. Nor does the Didache follow Ignatius and rail against people who do not believe the right things about Jesus, those who later became known as heretics. So, the Didache predates 1 Clement. Not so fast. Perhaps in Clement's bubble, in the capital of the empire, the Jesus clubs in the city had formed a structured organisation. But it is entirely possible that in the lands of the author of the Didache, wherever they were, the Jesus clubs were still the little isolated clubs of Paul's time. So let's take the easy way out. The Didache is roughly contemporary with 1 Clement. We aren't sure who the Didache was intended for. The book embodies traditions from the Gospel of Matthew, the most Jewish of the Gospels. It does not know Paul's theology. Some think it was written by Jewish Jesus clubs as an evangelization manual for Gentiles. Since the Didache refers to the two ways, it is possible that the author believed that his community was just another way to be Jewish. The Didache is full of ritual instructions. The book provides us with our earliest evidence of the ritual of baptism. Christians should perform baptisms in cold running water, although standing or warm water is permissible. If none of these options is available, water is to be poured over a person's head 3 times. Christians are to fast twice a week, on Wednesdays and Fridays. They should repeat the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. The ritual of the Eucharist, Holy Communion, recounted in the Didache, has really attracted the scrutiny of scholars. This central ritual of Christianity was first described by Paul. Quote, 1 Corinthians 11:23. For I, Paul, received from the Lord that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way he took the cup also, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. End quote. Paul describes a sacramental meal that imitates the Last Supper of Jesus and commemorates his death. The Last Supper was itself a Jewish Passover Seder, probably the ritual feast commemorating the Exodus. The Didache provides elaborate instructions for the Eucharist. It is a serious business. No outsiders invited. Quote, Didache 9:1. And concerning the Eucharist, first concerning the cup, say, We give thanks to you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, which you made known to us through Jesus your child. And concerning the broken bread, we give you thanks, our Father, for the life and knowledge which you made known to us through Jesus your child. As this broken bread was scattered upon the mountains, but was brought together and became one, so let your church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. For yours is the glory and the power, through Jesus Christ forever. But let none eat or drink of your Eucharist, except those who have been baptized in the Lord's name. For concerning this also did the Lord say, Give not that which is holy to the dogs. End quote. Notice something missing? The Didache does not mention the Last Supper or the death of Jesus. Until recently, scholars couldn't work out why Christians would create a symbolic meal other than to honour the death of Jesus. An answer has now presented itself. Some contemporary professors believe that the Didache lays bare the origins of the Eucharist as a Roman formal dinner. These dinners were fundamental to Roman social life. They were the essential bonding mechanism used by all social entities to create and maintain their identity. Wealthy Roman patrons hosted dinners for their clients. Households bonded over formal dinners, as did all sorts of collegia, what we would call clubs or associations. The banquet was central to social life. The Eucharist, these professors say, originated not as Paul's sacrament, but as a Christian appropriation of an old Mediterranean social ritual. Paul's statement in Corinthians was later used as theological justification. Modern scholars have begun to revisit other old verities about the origins of Christian practices. Until recently, researchers assumed that the Christians often adopted and modified Jewish practices. The academics followed rabbinic tradition that Jewish liturgy was remarkably stable through the centuries. The mighty rabbinic commentaries, the Talmudim, this tradition held, were reliable guides to first-century Jewish practices, although they were written centuries later. That's all gone out the window. The Talmudim are now viewed as testifying to the practices of their own time, many centuries after the destruction of the temple. They have little to tell us about 1st and 2nd century Judaism. The earliest Christian generations did not adapt Jewish liturgies and rituals because these practices were formed later in the synagogues, in the same centuries as Christians were independently developing their own practices. So the old academic pastime of finding Jewish antecedents for ancient Christian prayers is founded on the recognition that their whole quest is misguided. The Christians may have got there first. It is also entirely possible that Christian practices were influenced not by the Judaism that the rabbis ascribed, but by Jewish movements that vanished with the temple. And finally, several academics speculate that in some cases the Jews changed their practices to differentiate them from the Christians, not the other way around. Time to move on to Papias, or Papias, or Porpius, or Papias. I'll stick with Papias. Papias was the leader of the Jesus Club in Hierapolis, a town in what is now central Turkey. He wrote a book called Explanation of the Sayings of the Lord. That would make him the very first Christian critical commentator. Papias' book disappeared sometime in the late Middle Ages, leaving us with only quotations from later church fathers. Most scholars believe Papias was born just before the Great Revolt in 67. Papias knew the daughters of Philip the Evangelist, one of the deacons mentioned in Acts chapter 6. From those statements, we think that Papias began his career after the year 80 or 90. Some church fathers believed that Papias heard John the disciple preach. Well, that's possible. John was notoriously long-lived, dying around the year 100. The church historian Eusebius was deeply unimpressed by Papias, calling him a man of very limited understanding. Papias, like his older contemporary Clement, was honoured as the custodian of the words of the apostles. He was quite the fanboy. As quoted by later fathers, Papias said, quote, "I shall not hesitate to put down for you with my interpretations things I well learned at one time from the elders, for I did not take pleasure, as the multitude does, in those who say many things. But if perchance there came also anyone who had followed the elders, I made inquiry concerning what Andrew or what Peter had said, or what Philip or what Thomas or James or any of the other disciples of the Lord said. For I did not suppose that the things from the books would aid me, so much as things from the living and continuing voice." End quote. Papias doesn't trust written documents. He just doesn't believe them. He wants to hear living voices. Papias also gives us a tantalizing account of how Mark wrote his gospel. Quote, "Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately everything that he remembered, without, however, recording in order what was either said or done by Christ. Peter adapted his instructions to the needs of his hearers, but had no design of giving a connected account of the Lord's oracles. So then Mark made no mistake, while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them, for he made it his one care not to omit anything that he heard, or to set down any false statement." End quote. Of the evangelist Matthew, Papias records that Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could. Our Gospel of Matthew is in Greek, and shows no evidence of being translated from Hebrew. Was Papias referring instead to the Gospel of the Hebrews or Nazareans that I mentioned in episode 3.8, Earliest Christians Part 1, after the Great Revolt? Another mystery for scholars to tussle over. Now move on to Christianity's first great nutcase, Ignatius. If we know almost nothing of Clement and Papias, we have rather more on Ignatius, bishop of the great city of Antioch in Syria. Clement and Papias are little more than shadows. Ignatius is the first gripping Christian we meet after the New Testament, the most captivating personality since Paul. Traditional chronology argues that Ignatius was arrested by the Romans around the year 110, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan. That would be a decade or two after Clement and Papias flourished. The fathers claimed that he, like Papias, was a student of the disciple John. Again, that is credible, but only just. Other scholars argue Ignatius' martyrdom is more like the year 140. Now, that's a generation later. If Ignatius really did write around the year 140, and he really did know John, he must have been a very old man at his arrest. Ignatius was taken to Rome to die. During his trip, Ignatius managed to pen letters to 7 Jesus clubs. His letters rival Paul's in revealing a real human being. Ignatius' letters tell us much more about the man than the New Testament conveys about all the apostles, save for Peter, Paul and James. According to later tradition, Ignatius was quite the rock star. Supporters followed his prison donkey train, and others raced to catch a glimpse of the man along the way. We have no idea what Ignatius was charged with. Some scholars have suggested that he led riots, and he was charged with the capital crime of disturbing the peace. The mystery is compounded by the fact that the Romans dispatched him under guard to Rome for execution. Why not just chop his head off in Antioch? Perhaps some Roman bureaucrat dispatched him to the imperial capital as a sacrifice for the games. Some scholars, picking up on a late church tradition, argue Antioch is indeed where Ignatius died, and all his letters are pious fabrications. Who knows? Let's assume that at least some of the letters are real. Ignatius was determined to die. He was positively delirious about the prospect. Ignatius believed that martyrdom was a shortcut to heaven. If you were killed for your beliefs, you were sent to the front of the queue with an all-access backstage pass to Jesus' dressing room. His letters today read as slightly deranged in their determination to meet death. Now, listen to this. Quote, Letter to the Romans 4. I write to all the churches that I shall willingly die for God, unless you hinder me. I beseech of you not to show an unseasonable goodwill towards me. Suffer me to become food for the wild beasts. I am the wheat of God, and am ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, that I may be found the pure bread of God. Rather entice the wild beasts, that they may become my tomb, and may leave nothing of my body. Then shall I be a true disciple of Jesus Christ. But when I suffer, I shall be the freedman of Jesus Christ, and shall rise again emancipated in him. End quote. Ignatius also shows us that the democratic little Jesus house clubs, visited by the occasional itinerant preacher, were now on the highway that would soon lead to the imperial corporate church. And here is where the dating of Ignatius is a point of contention. Was this process in swing in the year 110, or not until 140? Whatever the dating, Ignatius shows that the scattered Jesus clubs have abandoned their traditional democratic organisation for hierarchies. Ignatius describes clubs with a 3-level hierarchy. At the bottom are the deacons, from the Greek diakonos, assistants. Next are the presbyters, from the Greek presbyteros, older guys. As the church has evolved, these transformed into the priestly caste. At the top of the chain is the bishop, from the Greek episkopos, or episkopos, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, meaning overseer. Here is Ignatius. Letter to the Trallians 2:1. For when you are subject to the bishop, as to Jesus Christ, you appear to me not to live according to man, but according to Jesus Christ, who died for us. It is necessary, therefore, that you should do nothing without the bishop, and that you should submit yourselves to the presbytery also, as to the apostles of Jesus Christ. It is necessary also that the deacons, being ministers of the mysteries of Jesus Christ, should in every way please all men. For they are not ministers of meat and drink, but servants of the church of God. Let all men reverence the deacons, and the bishops likewise, even as Jesus Christ, who is the Son of the Father, and to the presbyters as the council of God, and as the bond of the apostles. Without these there is no church. Some scholars believe that this administrative structure is a fusion of two different early Christian management systems. The Jews for Jesus fans adopted this scheme from their old synagogues, where a group of elders acted as a board of the synagogue. On the other hand, the pagan Christians took their cue from the structure of middle-class Roman households. In these, an overseer, the episkopos, was in charge of the servants, the deacons. Ignatius is adamant that bishops like himself are the leaders of the flock, and what they say goes. The bishops are the infallible representatives of the universal church, the Catholic Church. Ignatius is the first person to use that expression. He is also the first person to use the terms Christianity and heresy. To disagree with your bishop is to disagree with all the other Jesus clubs, and to be separated from Jesus. The largest episcopal modern churches, the Catholic and the Orthodox, embrace these views with enthusiasm and cite them as apostolic validation of their corporate nature. Most Protestants disagree. They believe that Christians must discover the truth individually, by their own reading of Scriptures. Even the Anglicans, Methodists and Lutherans, churches with bishops, leave the laity wiggle room. Ignatius totally disagrees with it. It is the bishop's job to define the truth, not yours. Ignatius has more to tell us about the emerging Jesus Club Corporation. His letters show us that the scattered Jesus clubs could not agree about the membership requirements for the emerging organisation. Ignatius rails against two contrary tendencies that would bedevil Christian thought for centuries: the inclination to honour Jesus as just a holy Jew, and the opposite trend, to regard him as a pure heavenly spirit. Ignatius' language against both is vituperative. Wild beasts, mad dogs, malicious deceivers. First, Ignatius attacks those Jesus clubs that encourage Jewish practices. Forget the Judeans, he says. Ignatius gives us the earliest evidence that Judaism and Christianity were beginning to part. Second, Ignatius attacks those other clubs who have gone off on their own planet and decided that Jesus was no more human than an angel. This belief was later called Docetism, from the Greek seems. Jesus seemed to be a man. Ignatius fulminates. Jesus was as human as the rest of us. He ate, he drank, he suffered, he died. If Jesus had not been a flesh and blood human who died, then what was the point of the death that Ignatius was about to endure? In my next show, I conclude the Apostolic Fathers with the Epistle of Barnabas, the Gospel of Peter, the Shepherd of Hermas, and Bishop Polycarp. Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.